So, good morning, Professor Krafts, and thank you for your highly interesting talk. To begin with, I would like to ask you, what is the main message you aim to convey to the audience during the speech?
I think the main message I was trying to convey to the audience was that although people are often very pessimistic about the 1930s, in fact it offers some clues about a way forward from our present problems. And it actually offers a much more optimistic picture than one sometimes hears, in particular because towards the end of that decade, economies were recovering really very well. And some of the policies that they used to achieve recovery are interesting for us to think about.
Moving to your professional career, you have been actively involved in the academia, both in the research and the teaching fields, in prestigious academic institutions such as Warwick and the London School of Economics. Now, which was the source of this interest in economic history?
I started doing economic history as a student. I was a student in Cambridge in the late 1960s. And economic history seemed to be full of interesting issues, interesting questions, and I think it was well taught. So I certainly didn't expect to become an economic historian. I thought I was studying economics. But interest in sort of long-run economic performance was what came from that.
And do you think this interest for the subject influence your role and your current position as director of the Center of Competitive Advantage in the Global Economy? Would you regard this appointment as the highlight of your professional career?
I think it's one of the most important things that I have done. So, it's quite an honour to be asked to be director. One of the things I think the Centre is doing, which is a bit unusual, is bringing a long-run perspective to today's policy issues and questions. And insofar as we have a distinctive niche among British research centres, I think it is that ability to bring insights from economic history, to use them to discuss present-day issues. That isn't all we do, but it is quite an important component of what we do. And I've always thought that a major reason for studying economic history is because it can, with care, offer insights which are useful today.
And given your role and given your interest in the European growth over the last year, and also given the several policy briefing papers you produced, what do you think of the current situation of the European Union, and especially which are its main economic strengths and weaknesses of this union?
I think the European Union, over its first 40 years or so from the Treaty of Rome in 1957, was a major success story, a massive achievement. In particular, it was extremely successful in raising levels of international trade within the Union. It did achieve relatively high levels of economic integration. Those greater trade levels in turn raised incomes, and I think it's reasonable to think that incomes of European citizens by the end of the 20th century were at least 10, perhaps 15, possibly even 20% higher than they might have been in the absence of the Union. So I take that to be a really serious success story. The European Union, to some extent, has operated on the basis of introducing imperfect designs and then refining them over time through additional treaties or whatever. Unfortunately, I think this idea of progress through trial and error and refinement has come rather seriously unstuck in the context of the Eurozone. The Eurozone, I'm afraid, represents a really major policy error. It has not been successful to any significant extent in further raising integration and trade, but it has trapped many countries into a prolonged recession from which it's very difficult to escape.
So in this regard, the United Kingdom would be seen in a privileged position, I would say, at this point. But what do you think of the European future outlook given the potential threat of the Brexit?
I think the UK, as other European countries have, benefited considerably from joining the European Union. Mm-hmm. I think it's fairly easy, again, to see British trade and income levels are higher than they would have been had we not joined. The very interesting feature of today's world compared with years ago is that the economists, at least, who seem to be in favour of Brexit, are actually saying we wish to do that to become even more free trading, actually to pursue free trade outside the constraint of the customs union. The people who didn't like Britain joining in the 1970s were pretty much to a person protectionists. They were deeply against freer trade. So there's a difference there. If you ask what Brexit would mean for the EU on the one hand, the rest of the EU and Britain on this side, I think Britain stands to lose more than the rest of the EU, at least in the short term, because although Britain is quite a large country, any decline in trade levels between Britain and the EU would have a bigger proportionate effect on the UK than on the rest of the EU. So in short-term economic effects, I suspect Britain has potentially more to lose, especially if what it does is simply to exit and then not pursue vigorous trade liberalisation through other channels. In the longer term, the issue's a bit more subtle, I think, because the question might be about what kind of reforms would be undertaken in the EU, what would be the future of the single market, what would be the nature of social legislation and so on. On those things, there are some countries, at least I think in the EU, who would welcome Britain's presence because of the stance it would generally take, which might be thought of as a more pro-market stance than some members would have. So if I'm Germany, if I'm the Netherlands, probably if I'm Sweden, I'd be inclined, I think, to think that Britain might often be quite a useful ally in considering future reform of the EU. But if one simply thinks of the short-term trade effects, Britain has the most to lose.
Moving to the next question and looking back at the past performances of the Western countries over the last few years and over the last century as well, what can we learn from their behavior to improve the future situation?
If you think of the long 20th century, starting perhaps a bit before 1900, taking up to the eve of the recent crisis, then I think that was a pretty successful period on average for the advanced countries, despite the traumas of 2 world wars and a Great Depression. Nevertheless, over that long period of time, there was very respectable economic growth on average. Living standards rose very significantly. Living standards, I think, rose quite a lot faster than real GDP per person. And that's because there are various things that improve that are not captured by GDP. The most obvious being increased life expectancy. If you ask what were the driving forces of those better living standards, that long-run economic growth, I think it does have to come back to technological progress. And if you ask which parts of the world have been most successful in technological progress, they are basically the advanced capitalist economies, in particular the United States. So I think what one looks to then are what are the components of a successful national innovation system. And if one thinks along those lines, I think it is investments in human capital. It is a structure which delivers high rates of research and development, but also it's an economy which allows creative destruction to operate. In other words, the old exit, the new enter. The old technologies are not allowed, as it were, to hold up the progress of the new. And I think that's what so many economies around the world struggle with. It's what Europe is much less good at than the United States. So it's a combination of the traditional components of a national innovation system with, I think, that quite important ingredient that you have this combination of exit and entry, which allows the relatively rapid assimilation of new technologies.
So would you say there are similarities between the old, let's say, international institutions and the current ones, which would enable the creation, like, foster and improvement of the economic situation?
If you're thinking about the supply side of an economy and this national innovation system, then to quite a large extent it seems to me that it's within the remit, within the policy space of individual countries to design effective systems. That said, I do think relatively free international trade is quite an important component of the improvement of technology over time. It aids things like technology transfer between countries. There's some quite good empirical evidence about these diffusion processes. That seems to me again to suggest that what one is hoping for is a world which is relatively open to trade as an important component of that technological spread, if you like, across the world. I think there's some good news and some bad news. The good news would be that we haven't really seen a return to the rampant protectionism of the 1930s since 2008. The bad news is that it does look rather as though the World Trade Organization is past its sell-by date. Is no longer an effective way further to liberalise trade, and that we are perhaps in an era where populist pressures will make further development of things like free trade agreements harder than in the past. So I think that's not such a bad outcome considering the shock the world has been through, but it leaves a little bit of cause for concern.
We're getting at the end of the interview, and I hope you enjoyed your time here at the summit. As last question, I would like to ask you, what is your opinion of World Economic Summit 2016?
I have enjoyed my time at the summit. I think the design is better than last time I was a speaker, which I think was 10 years ago. Clearly the summit is bigger. I like the idea of the small sort of delegates meet the speaker sessions. I thought the programme, it's got some high profile, very good people there. And I gather, and certainly there was a big audience this morning, that the take-up of purchase of tickets and so on has been good. So, I see this as a really successful innovation, and I think Warwick was a leader here. Lots of other places have been following. But the evolution of the concept seems to me to leave you still in a strong position. The competition hasn't, as yet anyway, overtaken you.
Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for the interview.
Okay, very good. Thanks for the questions. Nice questions.